Welcome to the dark world of scary stories. A place where every sound is a premonition of the unknown, and every shadow is a step into another dimension. If you're ready to open the door to the scariest secrets, subscribe to the channel and don't forget to hit the bell, because the scariest is yet to come. Turn on the light and let's begin. The Ghost Train. The first time the ghost train appeared was when Liam, a young scientist from New York, boarded a train to visit his father in a small town to the south. Liam didn't think it would be his last journey, nor did he imagine that what he would witness would never leave him in peace. This train was special. Its departures had no set schedules, and no announcement could accurately predict when it would arrive at a station. Those who traveled on it usually disappeared without a trace. But it was precisely because nothing could explain this phenomenon that Liam became so intrigued and decided to see it with his own eyes. He boarded the train willingly. On the outside, it looked ordinary: worn seats, old-fashioned lamps that barely lit. However, there was one thing that troubled him: the complete silence in the air. All the passengers sat quietly, and Liam couldn't make out a single expression on anyone's face. At the moment the train started moving, an inexplicable feeling began to settle on him. There was something off, something hidden behind those vague, lifeless faces. And it was then that his gaze stopped at one of the windows. In the west, in the darkness, he saw a strange light, slowly flickering, unlike the street lamps outside. Something invisible and unexplainable began. Liam took note of the passengers around him: old people with stony gazes, women with chronic signs of fatigue, and children staring at a single point without moving their eyes. Their movements became increasingly mechanical, and then suddenly, one of them, a man in a long black coat sitting opposite him, began whispering words that made no sense. "You will all die here," he repeated, his face frozen. Liam could not contain his terror. It felt as though the train was taking them not to the real world but to some distant dimension. But where was this dimension? And why did everyone who saw it later disappear? Suddenly, the light on the train went out. The train rolled into absolute darkness, and that moment became the scariest of his life. He couldn't see anything around him, not even his hands, which he had raised to his face. Liam felt his heart beat heavily, and the fear seemed to reach a breaking point. A few minutes later, the light suddenly came back on, and Liam saw how everything had changed. The passengers were no longer sitting in their places. They stood, their faces looked like blurred shadows, and in their eyes was something strange, as if they were no longer human. Liam tried to get up, but suddenly a figure appeared before him. It was the same man in the black coat, but now he looked completely different. His face was distorted, blood dripping from his mouth, and his hands moved in a vague manner, as if each movement was part of something mechanical. "Do you not understand what's happening here?" he whispered quietly. Liam, gritting his teeth, tried to push him away, but the man kept speaking. "You're here because we chose you. You're here because you can't escape. This is a train for those who won't return. Do you understand now?" The passengers began to move again, but this time they walked straight towards Liam, and each of their steps was heavy and stiff, like a body without freedom. They approached with disgusting smiles on their faces, smiles that had nothing human about them. At that moment, Liam realized he wouldn't be able to escape. All these people, these creatures, all of this was part of something far greater and more sinister than just a nighttime journey. He took a few steps back, but the train kept moving relentlessly, unwilling to stop. And the further he traveled, the more he realized that this train had no final destination. Where it would end, no one knew. And all who tried to find an exit would remain forever a part of this journey into the darkness. All the passengers on the train, who began to move forward, now seemed like part of a terrifying, soulless machine. Liam tried to stay calm, but his heart was pounding in his chest, as if it were on the verge of tearing apart. He took a few more steps back, but the train didn't stop. Why wasn't it stopping? This was impossible. His mind began to slowly unravel from this distorted nightmare unfolding around him. Suddenly, one of the passengers, a young man in a dark coat, stepped closer to him. His eyes were empty, like a dead person's, and Liam felt a coldness beginning to fill every cell of his body. The man barely whispered, "Do you think this shouldn't be happening? That you can escape? You're wrong. None of us are here by choice. We've become part of this train. This endless journey." Liam swung his arm, trying to push him away, but the man's hands suddenly became as hard as steel, and for the first time, he felt how impossible it was to escape this fate. Some invisible force was drawing him deeper into the darkness of the train. In fact, this train wasn't an ordinary form of transport. It had become just a shell for something much more terrifying. Liam suddenly realized that these people hadn't just become passengers on this train. They had become part of an experiment. And this experiment had no end. What was this train? Where was its final station? Its sails were like those of a ship truly in a world without light, without space, without time. In the next moment, the train suddenly stopped. But stopping was the one thing Liam feared the most. Why now? And why had the train become so silent? Suddenly, the doors of the carriages opened, and they slowly began to slide open as if inviting him into a dark, endless corridor. And then he saw something that became the final proof that this was not just a nightmare. Something inhuman. As he tried to understand what was happening, creatures began emerging from the dark corners of the train. They resembled humans, but their skin looked like a boiled mask, and scars on their heads resembled the marks left by brutal experiments. One of them approached Liam. It was hard for him to breathe because of the stench of decay filling the air. There was nothing but emptiness in its eyes. The creature silently extended its hand to Liam. "We are all here for science," it whispered with a serious expression on its face. "For the experiment. You're part of it now." Liam couldn't understand what had happened to his mind when he realized the truth. This train was part of a large experiment carried out by scientists who had long forgotten ethical norms. They were selecting people who accidentally boarded the train, and then conducting cruel experiments on them, experiments that couldn't even be called human. "This has happened to all of us," the man continued, his voice like the whisper of the dead. "All of us who entered this train won't get out alive. And every experiment, every search for the limits of human consciousness and body, has made us part of this ghost train. And it cannot be stopped." Liam understood. It was a trap from which there was no escape. He could only accept his fate. The passengers on the train became much closer to each other, their faces and hands growing paler, and the scars on their bodies began to look even more grotesque. But one thing was clear: they were no longer human. They had become part of a dark, relentless experiment. And this train wasn't just a means of transport, it was a palace of horrors, carrying them in circles through hell from which there was no escape. Now Liam was at the center of this nightmare, but even he didn't know if he could break free from this hell or if he would vanish just like everyone else who had tried to understand what was really happening aboard this ghost train. And the train started moving again, sliding into the darkness. The darkness of the train consumed everything around. Liam felt how every meter the train covered on its endless journey squeezed his heart more and more. But the scariest part wasn't that he couldn't escape. The scariest part was that with each new station, with each stop, he started to believe more and more in what the man in the black coat had said. They were all part of something much bigger than just an incomprehensible train. The carriage he was sitting in began to change. At first, he didn't notice how it happened, but now Liam wasn't sitting in a regular carriage. He was in a room that resembled a laboratory more than a place for travel. The walls were covered with steel plates, and scattered across the floor were tools that looked like surgical instruments. All the surfaces appeared cold and metallic, as if experiments were being conducted here, in the heart of the train. Looking at himself, Liam saw that his own hands had changed. They had become paler, and the skin was like coal. He felt as if something was being destroyed inside his body. And this wasn't just a feeling of fear. It was the feeling of losing his humanity. He turned his attention to those still sitting next to him, those who had once been human. Now, their faces were unfamiliar, distorted, with frozen, almost plastic features. Their eyes were empty, and there was no emotion in them. They didn't move, they just sat there, like mannequins. They can't feel, whispered the man in the black coat, who had appeared beside Liam once again. They've all become part of this cycle. This isn't just a train. It's a mechanism that collects human souls. And everyone who ends up here has no chance. Liam asked, not understanding what he was hearing. What do you mean? What is the purpose of all this? The man simply smiled, his smile resembling a distorted reflection. Purpose. The purpose is to break everything we know about reality. The purpose is to find the limits of human existence that even science can't measure. Here, on this train, we conduct experiments that change the nature of humanity. Did you think these trains run on a regular route? No, they collect our souls, testing us at the boundary between life and death, at the boundary of experiments that long ago stopped following ethical laws. You are just another element of our research. The passengers sitting around him began to slowly rise, and now their movements seemed not just mechanical. They were those who had lost their humanity and no longer had any feelings for what was happening around them. Liam saw one of them approaching him and extending a hand. He couldn't muster the strength to push it away, as some invisible force was pulling him into this stream of infinity. Do you want to see what happens next? Asked the passenger. Liam felt how the cold was spreading over him more and more. He was scared, but he couldn't resist. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. His mind couldn't withstand the constant flow of terror surrounding him. The train stopped again, and Liam saw how large metal doors opened before him. He didn't want to move forward, but some invisible forces were pulling him inside. And suddenly, he saw what became his final nightmare. A large hall, covered in a slippery black material, and strange devices standing in the middle of the room. On the tables were dark chemical substances, and around stood people in white coats, their faces resembling soulless shadows. They were working with some organs and tissues, experimenting on the bodies of those brought by the train. Liam realized that this wasn't just a train. It was a laboratory for creating something new, something dark that combined science and the horrors of the human body. Then one of the doctors approached him, his face like a mask, and extended his hands toward Liam's chest. Welcome to our experiment. You will be part of a new stage. You are the material we've been looking for. You are part of something greater. And he felt how it became harder to breathe, how his body began to succumb to this terrifying world. The train moved forward, and Liam was left in this nightmare with no chance of escape. The train began moving again, and Liam felt his body fill with cold that gradually squeezed his lungs, like an icy gust of wind. Strange sounds echoed from every corner of this nightmarish train. It seemed as though the very structure of the train was alive. Creaks, thuds, sounds that resembled the muffled groan of the walls, bouncing off the metal and piercing his brain. In reality, he was no longer sure what was happening. This was no longer just an experiment. It was something much worse. This train didn't just transport people. It transformed them. It broke them, reshaping their existence. It was a machine that destroyed human souls and created new monsters that had nothing in common with humans. Liam slowly rose from his seat, feeling his legs tremble with weakness. It seemed like his body no longer obeyed him, but he forced himself to take a few steps until he found himself by one of the train's doors. He touched the metal, which felt as cold as death. And it was then that his eyes stopped on something that could no longer be ignored. On the wall was an old plaque, covered in dust and rust, with the inscription, Test 47, Alternative Realities. Liam felt his heart beat stronger again, adrenaline flooding through his veins. He couldn't understand what it meant, but he sensed it was connected to what was happening right now. It was another stage of the experiment, another part of their terrifying plan. As soon as his gaze met the plaque again, the train abruptly stopped, and Liam couldn't hold himself back. His hands began to tremble, and he felt a strange shock as the train doors opened by themselves. The room before him was filled with fog so thick that Liam could barely see anything. But what he saw next was horrifying. The fog started to dissipate, and Liam saw enormous metal containers standing in deep channels, attached to elements of human bodies. There were severed arms, legs, heads, parts of bodies that looked as if they had been discarded, but not destroyed, merely distorted. It was like a vast collection of eerie artifacts, where each element was part of something greater, something that held special value for this laboratory. Liam felt like one of them, the last part of this dreadful machine. He wasn't just a witness. He was a participant in this insane scene. He stepped closer to one of the containers and saw inside a man he once knew, his friend Eric, who had disappeared years ago on this very train. But now, he was just part of this world, a soulless creature with mechanical parts replacing his own body. Liam barely restrained himself from screaming, but he felt that this scream wouldn't reach the world he once lived in. He was lost in the endless train, where there was no time or space. There was no human dignity here, only the brutal idea that people had become a resource for others, for experiments, for research, for studying how far one could go to break a person. But this wasn't the end. Something even bigger and scarier awaited ahead. A hazy light flickered at the far end of the hall, and Liam realized it wasn't meant to help him escape. This light marked the discovery of a new stage in the experiment. The illuminated place behind it, which seemed endless and too complicated for ordinary comprehension, was the very place where the train was heading to new levels of horror. Now, Liam was no longer just a witness to the horrifying events. He was part of them. And along with everyone else, he had to go through this trial. The train had no intention of going back, and he too could no longer return to the world that once seemed ordinary and familiar. This train was a prelude to something entirely different. And every passenger who ended up here wasn't just a victim. They were an experimental subject, part of the relentless machine that moved on endlessly. And now, as Liam walked toward that ghostly light, he knew one thing. There was no way back. Only forward. Only endless experiments with no end in sight. Liam began to move forward, feeling his steps echo dully in the bottomless silence. The light flickering at the end of the hall was so faint that it seemed like a hallucination in the darkness. His footsteps bounced off the cold metal walls, and with each new movement, it felt as though the train was closing in around him, like a trap tightening more and more. As Liam approached the light, he saw that it wasn't just a source illuminating his path, but a huge monitor. On the screen, horrifying images were playing. Various bodies shifting shape, parts of people transforming into something else. It was a live recording of the experiments being conducted here on the train. People who had ended up here had become part of these terrible studies. Explosions of pain, altered realities. All these elements were part of the most monstrous experiments taking place aboard. On the screen, Liam saw another horrifying image. He saw himself. Yes, it was his face, his body, but transformed, distorted as a result of these experiments. He wasn't ready for this. Liam couldn't believe that his body had become part of these merciless transformations. He felt like a spectator of his own cruel fate, which was simply revealing the mechanisms of this terrifying world where he was no longer human. And it was then that he realized, this wasn't just a trial, it was a trap that closed in on anyone who stepped onto this train. And if he stayed here, they would transform him, he would become part of the very mechanism that left nothing human behind. Liam ran toward the monitor, trying to uncover all these horrors, trying to understand if there was any chance of escape. And then the screen changed again. Now, he saw images of people disappearing into the darkness. They seemed to vanish without a trace, as though they were absorbed by the very essence of this place. Suddenly, a figure appeared from the corridor again. It was a man standing in the shadows, but his eyes burned with red light. Liam saw something familiar in his gaze, but couldn't immediately recall who he was. "Turn away," the man said, his voice so deep that it felt like it pierced Liam's very heart. "You can't change anything. This is not just a train. This is no longer your life. This is what's left after it." The man approached Liam, and now he recognized him. It was the same man who had met him at the very beginning of this nightmarish journey, and who had also become part of this experiment. "What does all this mean?" Liam asked, watching as the man slowly moved closer. "You know," the man whispered. "You know everything. We are all part of this hell that has no end. We are the experiments that became living tortures. And the worst part is, you're becoming just like us. This train isn't just a journey. It's a transition between worlds, between reality and illusion. Anyone who steps on this train can never go back. Liam felt his heart tighten. He began to realize that no attempt to escape could change his fate. This place didn't just cut a person off from reality. It replaced it with another existence, one that was cruel, unbearable, and eternal. The man touched Liam's shoulder, and his hand was cold, like ice. You will become one of us. Just as we became part of this world, so will you. This is a step you can't avoid. You lost yourself, and now you're here, in this endless cycle. And suddenly, Liam felt his body begin to change. He felt parts of him growing cold and lifeless, as though they were transforming into metal. The pain was unbearable. It wasn't just physical pain, but a deep, soul-crushing anguish as he felt everything human disappear from him. But he couldn't stop. The train car continued to move into the darkness, absorbing everyone who came into its path, turning them into parts of this relentless experiment. And Liam knew one thing. He was no longer human. He had become part of this terrifying machine that moved into infinity. The train of ghosts had no end. Liam stood in the silent darkness, which seemed endless, and his mind began to lose its ability to navigate this new world. He felt that the train was not just moving along the tracks, it was part of this reality, created by others, soulless, dehumanized beings. All these people who ended up here, they were nothing more than elements, components of this mechanism. He was, like them, just a fragment of something huge and ominous. Liam's body felt like an empty shell, one that had lost its essence. With every step, he felt his flesh becoming less alive, and the sensation of pain gradually turning into a cold, emotionless void. His heart no longer beat as it used to, and his breathing had become mechanical. It seemed as if he was no longer breathing but merely performing a repetitive program. This is what they do to us, Liam thought. This is what we're meant for. Now, as he looked around, he saw that everything had changed. The carriage had become even more enclosed, its walls now covered with strange symbols that glimmered in the dark, like a coded message from those who controlled these experiments. The sound of the wheels on the tracks had grown louder, like the rhythm of a heartbeat, but it was foreign, mechanical, cruel. And more, Liam felt that this train wasn't just traveling on the railway, it had no final stop. It was an endless journey through places where humans no longer existed. After his mind realized that he could no longer go back, that he had become part of this mechanism, that he was no longer who he once was, Liam made one last attempt to find an escape. His mind went back to that very moment when it all started, when he was still an ordinary man, dreaming of a journey, looking to the future with hope. He began walking forward, trying to understand if he could find even a tiny piece of that world where he could feel alive again. But the darkness consumed him more and more, and when he reached the end of the corridor, the same dark figure appeared before him. It was the man in the black coat. You can't escape. His voice was quiet but clear. This is no longer your choice. You've become part of this train. And we no longer have any control over who we are. Liam felt his legs grow heavy again, as though he were moving through some invisible cloud. His body no longer obeyed him. He couldn't make himself stop this endless movement. The man stepped closer, and Liam saw in his eyes the same merciless reflection of this reality. You've become just another test subject in our experiment, the man continued. Just like all of us. Everyone who comes here is deprived of the ability to choose. During the experiment, we don't just change bodies. We change reality, we change the very essence of a person. You are no longer you. You've become part of us. And in that moment, Liam understood. He hadn't just become a victim. He wasn't just someone taken from his world. He had become part of the endless network of experiments that had no end. He had become part of this nightmare, and now there was no way back. The train continued its journey. And even when Liam surrendered, when his physical body could no longer bear the strain of this transformation, his consciousness still remained in that same train, in that same mechanism, moving along the endless tracks of time. He was no longer alone in this darkness. All the passengers who had vanished here before him had become just like him. They lived in their immortal shadow, and this train, moving through eternal night, had become their new world. Their reality no longer had anything to do with what had once been. Now Liam was one of them. And the train continued its endless journey. And so, as darkness once again envelopes you, we say goodbye, but not for long. Remember, the night is never truly safe. Subscribe so you don't miss the new horrors, and come back when it's time for new nightmares. Beware of the shadows, they are always near. Until next time.